Sometimes a single phone call doesn't save a life. It exposes a lie that someone in power spent years believing. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalks of Ashcroft, Ohio, where people hurried between coffee shops, office buildings, and the old brick city hall that had overlooked Main Street for nearly a century. It looked like any other Thursday, the kind where nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen. Cars rolled through green lights, construction crews packed up for the day, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery across the street. Standing quietly near a public information kiosk was a tall black man wearing a navy polo shirt, dark jeans, clean white sneakers, and a modest wristwatch that revealed nothing about his status or profession. Marcus Ellington carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who had learned long ago that real authority rarely needed to announce itself. His eyes moved naturally across the square, noticing broken pavement near the bus stop, a flickering streetlight that would soon need repair, and a group of teenagers helping an elderly veteran load groceries into his pickup truck. He smiled almost instinctively. Moments like those reminded him why public service mattered. Across the intersection, Officer Ethan Caldwell sat inside his patrol SUV finishing paperwork after responding to a noise complaint. Restless and impatient, he scanned the sidewalks while waiting for another dispatch. His attention settled almost immediately on Marcus. The neatly folded city maintenance maps tucked under Marcus's arm looked ordinary enough. Yet Ethan convinced himself something felt suspicious. Instead of watching behavior, he focused on appearance, allowing assumptions to replace observation. Within seconds he stepped out of the cruiser, adjusted his duty belt, and crossed the street with the certainty of someone who believed his instincts never failed him. Several pedestrians slowed as they noticed the officer approaching. Marcus looked up before Ethan reached him and offered a polite nod. "Good afternoon, officer." Ethan ignored the greeting. "I need to see some identification." Marcus remained composed. "Certainly. May I ask what prompted the stop?" The question, respectful and measured, seemed to irritate Ethan more than if Marcus had argued. "I'm asking the questions," Ethan replied. "Hand me your ID." Marcus slowly reached toward his wallet exactly as instructed, making every movement deliberate and visible. Nearby, Emily Foster, the owner of a neighborhood coffee shop, had stepped outside carrying a tray of empty cups destined for the recycling bin. She paused, sensing an uncomfortable shift in the atmosphere. Nothing about the interaction looked dangerous, yet something about the officer's tone made her set the tray down and quietly watch from the doorway. Marcus handed over his driver's license without hesitation. Ethan studied it for only a second before glancing back at Marcus with narrowed eyes, as though he had already decided the document couldn't possibly explain why a black man in casual clothes was standing near City Hall. "What exactly are you doing here?" he demanded. "Walking the neighborhood," Marcus answered calmly. "Looking over a few community projects." Ethan gave a short laugh that carried more disbelief than humor. "Community projects?" he repeated. "You expect me to believe that?" Marcus never raised his voice. "You asked." I answered honestly. Around them, conversations began to fade. People instinctively slowed their pace, sensing tension without fully understanding it. Emily discreetly reached for her phone, not to interfere but to document what she hoped would simply end with a misunderstanding. Marcus noticed her movement but said nothing. He had spent enough years serving the public to understand that calm often revealed more than anger ever could. Ethan folded his arms, looked Marcus up and down once more, and made a decision before gathering a single fact. "Turn around," he said firmly. "For now, you're being detained while I sort this out." Marcus held Ethan's gaze for a brief moment, then quietly answered, "Officer, before this goes any further, I'd like to make one phone call." Ethan shook his head with a dismissive smile. "You can worry about phone calls later." Marcus took one slow breath, glanced once toward the clock tower above City Hall, and replied in a voice so steady it barely rose above the afternoon traffic. "I was hoping you wouldn't say that." Marcus slowly turned as instructed, keeping both hands visible and making no sudden movements. His expression remained calm, not because he was unaware of the growing tension, but because years of public service had taught him that dignity was often tested in moments when no one expected it. Officer Ethan Caldwell stepped closer, maintaining a firm but increasingly suspicious tone. "Place your hands where I can see them." Marcus complied immediately. Around them, the ordinary rhythm of downtown Ashcroft seemed to pause. Conversations softened. A delivery driver stopped unloading boxes outside a pharmacy. Two office workers lingered near a crosswalk, exchanging uncertain glances. Emily Foster remained near the entrance of her coffee shop, her phone held discreetly at chest level. She had seen police officers conduct professional stops countless times before, yet something about this interaction felt different. It was not the procedure that concerned her. It was the certainty with which conclusions seemed to have been reached before questions had even been answered. Ethan looked once more at Marcus's driver's license. "You say you are inspecting community projects. Who exactly are you working for?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "The city of Ashcroft." Ethan gave a skeptical smile. "Doing what?" "Serving the people." The response was truthful, but it was also incomplete. Marcus had deliberately chosen not to mention his title because he believed respect should never depend upon a person's position. Ethan interpreted the answer as evasive. "That is not an actual job description." Marcus simply nodded. "No, officer. It is a responsibility." Ethan exhaled impatiently. "You are making this harder than it needs to be." Marcus quietly replied, "I do not believe I am." The small crowd continued to grow. No one shouted. No one interfered. They simply watched, sensing that every word carried more weight than either man realized. Emily noticed an older veteran standing beside her. He whispered, almost to himself, "That gentleman has not raised his voice once." She silently agreed. Ethan radioed dispatch, requesting a routine identification check. The response came back almost immediately. Marcus Ellington had no outstanding warrants, no criminal record, no active investigations, and a valid driver's license. For a brief second, uncertainty crossed Ethan's face. The information did not support the picture he had already formed in his mind. He could have ended the encounter right there. Instead, he doubled down. "Stay where you are," he ordered. Marcus remained still. Then he spoke in the same measured tone he had used from the beginning. "Officer, I would still appreciate the opportunity to make one phone call." Ethan shook his head again. "You are not in a position to make requests." Marcus looked directly at him. "I understand your authority. I simply hope you understand your responsibility." Those words lingered in the afternoon air longer than anyone expected. Emily noticed Ethan's jaw tighten. Rather than calming the situation, Marcus's composure seemed to frustrate him even more. Several people exchanged uneasy looks, wondering why a routine stop was continuing after dispatch had already found nothing suspicious. At that exact moment, a black sport utility vehicle turned onto Main Street before slowing unexpectedly at the far end of the block. It remained parked without approaching, its driver watching quietly from behind the windshield. Marcus noticed it immediately but gave no visible reaction. Ethan never looked in its direction. Instead, he reached for his radio once more, determined to prove that his instincts could not possibly be wrong. As the dispatcher acknowledged his second request, the driver inside the parked vehicle picked up a phone and spoke only 6 calm words before ending the call. And less than a minute later, somewhere inside City Hall, a secure line began to ring. The secure phone inside City Hall rang only twice before it was answered. The voice on the other end listened carefully, offered no interruption, and ended the conversation with a single sentence. "Understood. We are on our way." Back on Main Street, neither Marcus Ellington nor Officer Ethan Caldwell had any idea that the call had already set several quiet decisions into motion. Ethan lowered his radio and stepped closer. "Dispatch cannot find anything unusual about you," he said, sounding almost disappointed. "That does not mean this stop is over." Marcus met his eyes without hostility. "I never expected special treatment, officer. I only expected a fair one." The words landed harder than Ethan cared to admit. They were spoken without sarcasm, without challenge, and without fear. Around them, the crowd continued to grow as people leaving nearby offices slowed to watch. A father holding his young son's hand quietly guided the boy to the opposite side of the sidewalk, not out of fear, but because he sensed an uncomfortable lesson unfolding in real time. Emily Foster continued recording from outside her coffee shop. She deliberately kept her camera pointed wide enough to capture the entire interaction rather than focusing on either individual. She believed context mattered. A city employee wearing a reflective safety vest approached cautiously from across the street. He recognized Marcus immediately and instinctively started walking faster before Marcus caught his eye with the slightest shake of his head. It was almost imperceptible, but the employee understood the message. Do not interfere. The man stopped where he was, pretending to examine a nearby parking meter while quietly pulling out his own phone. Ethan noticed none of it. Instead, he asked another question. Why were you standing near City Hall? Marcus answered truthfully once again. I was checking on several projects that residents have been asking about. Ethan folded his arms. Do you expect me to believe you inspect public projects wearing jeans and sneakers? Marcus glanced down briefly at his clothes before looking back up. Public sidewalks do not care what shoes you wear. A few people nearby exchanged restrained smiles. The answer was simple, respectful, and impossible to argue with. Ethan interpreted the reaction as people laughing at him instead. His frustration became more obvious. He looked toward the gathering crowd and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. Nobody leaves until I finish determining what is going on here. The statement had the opposite effect. More people slowed their pace. Some quietly opened their phones, not to provoke the situation, but because unusual encounters in public spaces often deserved documentation. Emily noticed a white city maintenance truck turn onto the block before slowing almost to a stop. Its driver looked toward Marcus with visible concern, then reached for a handheld radio instead of getting out. At nearly the same moment, Sergeant Daniel Brooks walked out of the police substation less than a block away after hearing Ethan's second dispatch request. Brooks was a veteran supervisor who believed routine encounters should remain exactly that, routine. As he started toward Main Street, dispatch informed him that there had been no legal basis uncovered for extended detention. Brooks frowned slightly. That information should have resolved the encounter, not prolonged it. Halfway down the sidewalk, he looked ahead and saw the unusually large crowd forming around Ethan's patrol vehicle. His pace quickened. Meanwhile, Marcus quietly checked the time on his watch. He had missed the beginning of a meeting he had personally scheduled for 4 o'clock inside City Hall. Several department directors were already waiting upstairs, unaware of the reason for the delay. Ethan noticed the gesture and said sharply, "You are in no position to worry about your schedule." Marcus answered with remarkable calm. "Actually, officer, a great many people may soon be affected by it." Ethan dismissed the comment as another attempt to sound important. But less than 30 seconds later, every phone inside the city manager's executive conference room vibrated at exactly the same moment. Inside the executive conference room on the 3rd floor of City Hall, every conversation stopped as phones vibrated almost simultaneously across the polished oak table. Department directors exchanged confused looks, while the city manager read the brief message that had just arrived through an internal emergency channel. Contained only one line. The mayor has not arrived. His last known location is Main Street near City Hall. Chairs slid back as the meeting dissolved into quiet urgency. No one panicked. They simply understood that something highly unusual had interrupted a man whose schedule was known for its precision. Down on the sidewalk, Sergeant Daniel Brooks finally reached the edge of the gathering crowd. Years of experience had taught him that large audiences rarely formed around ordinary police encounters. He noticed Marcus standing exactly where he had been moments earlier, calm and cooperative. He noticed Emily still recording from a respectful distance. He noticed Ethan maintaining complete confidence despite dispatch reporting no evidence of criminal activity. Brooks approached with measured professionalism. "Officer Caldwell," he said evenly, "bring me up to speed." Ethan answered immediately. "Subject has been acting suspiciously near City Hall. His explanation does not make sense. and I believe further investigation is necessary. Brooks looked toward Marcus. Sir, have you complied with Officer Caldwell's instructions? Marcus answered without hesitation. Yes, Sergeant. I provided identification immediately and answered every question that was asked. Brooks nodded. Have you been informed that you are under arrest? No, Sergeant. Have you been issued a citation? No, Sergeant. Brooks paused for a moment, carefully considering everything he had just heard. The facts were straightforward. The situation was not. Before he could ask another question, Ethan spoke again. Something is off about this entire situation. I can feel it. Brooks answered quietly enough that only Ethan could hear. Instinct is useful, officer. It is not evidence. The words hung in the air. Marcus remained silent, allowing the conversation to unfold without interruption. Across the street, the driver of the black sport utility vehicle finally stepped outside. Dressed in a dark business suit with a small communication earpiece barely visible beneath his collar, he did not approach immediately. Instead, he observed the entire scene with disciplined patience while speaking softly into a lapel microphone. Emily noticed him first. He did not behave like an ordinary bystander. He watched exits, scanned the crowd, and maintained constant awareness of his surroundings. She quietly wondered who he was protecting. At nearly the same moment, a convoy of 3 city vehicles turned onto Main Street several blocks away after leaving City Hall together. Their emergency lights remained off. They obeyed every traffic signal. Nothing about their approach was dramatic, yet pedestrians instinctively glanced toward them as they moved steadily closer. Ethan remained completely unaware. He focused entirely on Marcus. You have had every opportunity to explain yourself, he said. Marcus answered with the same calm voice that had never once changed in tone. Officer, I have explained myself truthfully from the beginning. Whether you believe me has always been your decision. Brooks looked carefully at Marcus for several seconds. There was something familiar about his face, something he could not quite place. Before he could search his memory further, his department-issued phone rang. The caller identification displayed only 2 words. City Manager. Brooks excused himself by a few steps and answered immediately. As he listened, the color slowly drained from his face. His eyes shifted toward Marcus, then toward Ethan, and finally back toward the approaching city vehicles that had just turned the corner onto Main Street. Sergeant Daniel Brooks remained silent as the call continued. He listened carefully, his posture becoming noticeably straighter with every passing second. When the line finally went quiet, he answered with only 4 words. Yes, I understand completely. He lowered the phone slowly and looked across the sidewalk at Marcus Ellington with an expression that had changed from routine professionalism to unmistakable concern. Ethan noticed it immediately. Sergeant, what is going on? Brooks did not answer right away. Instead, he asked Marcus a simple question. Sir, have you been attempting to reach someone from City Hall? Marcus nodded once. I requested 1 phone call several times. Brooks glanced briefly toward Ethan before looking back at Marcus. Were you ever given that opportunity? Marcus answered honestly. No, Sergeant. The silence that followed seemed heavier than any conversation. Ethan folded his arms. With respect, Sergeant, I was still investigating the situation. Brooks replied evenly. Dispatch already confirmed there were no warrants, no criminal history, and no evidence supporting continued suspicion. Ethan opened his mouth to respond but stopped when he noticed the 3 city vehicles pulling to the curb less than 50 yards away. None displayed flashing lights. None arrived with urgency. Yet the moment the engines shut off, several well-dressed officials stepped out almost simultaneously. The city manager was among them, accompanied by the director of public works, the chief administrative officer, and 2 members of the mayor's executive staff. None of them spoke as they walked toward the gathering crowd. Emily lowered her phone for the first time since the encounter began. She recognized nearly every face approaching from City Hall. Around her, whispers spread through the spectators. Why would they all come here? One woman quietly asked. No one had an answer. Halfway across the street, the suited man from the black sport utility vehicle finally began walking as well. His pace remained controlled, his attention focused entirely on Marcus, while maintaining awareness of everyone else nearby. Ethan felt the atmosphere changing but refused to reconsider his earlier decisions. "This does not prove anything," he said quietly. Brooks answered without taking his eyes off the approaching officials. "No, officer. It proves something is happening that deserves our full attention." Marcus remained exactly where he had been standing since the encounter began. His hands rested comfortably at his sides. His breathing never quickened. His expression revealed neither satisfaction nor frustration. He simply waited. Years in public office had taught him that truth often arrived more quietly than accusation. As the city manager reached the edge of the crowd, he immediately scanned the scene until his eyes settled on Marcus. Relief crossed his face for only a brief moment before professionalism returned. He approached respectfully but stopped several feet away, carefully acknowledging the ongoing police encounter. "Good afternoon," he said calmly. "May I speak with this gentleman for a moment?" Ethan instinctively answered before anyone else could. "Not until I determine exactly who he is." Several city officials exchanged puzzled looks. Brooks slowly closed his eyes for the briefest instant, realizing the situation had just become significantly more complicated. The city manager looked directly at Ethan, then back toward Marcus, as though trying to understand how such a simple question could still exist. Marcus offered only the slightest nod, silently signaling everyone from City Hall to remain calm. Then, in a measured voice that carried across the suddenly silent sidewalk, the city manager spoke a single sentence that caused every conversation in the crowd to stop at once. "Officer, are you telling me you truly do not recognize the mayor of Ashcroft?" For several long seconds, no one moved. The sounds of passing traffic, distant construction, and conversations from nearby storefronts seemed to disappear beneath the weight of a single question. Officer Ethan Caldwell stared at the city manager as though he had misheard him. "The mayor?" he repeated quietly. The city manager gave a slow nod. "Yes, Mayor Marcus Ellington." Ethan instinctively looked back at Marcus, searching for some sign that this was a misunderstanding, some indication that everyone around him had made the same impossible mistake. Instead, Marcus simply stood where he had been from the beginning, calm, composed, and completely unchanged by the sudden revelation. He had not announced his title. He had not demanded special treatment. He had not raised his voice. The truth had arrived without him forcing it into the conversation. Emily Foster lowered her phone for only a moment, her heart racing as she replayed everything she had just recorded. Every respectful answer, every request to make one phone call, every opportunity for the situation to end peacefully. She quietly resumed recording, realizing the most important part of the story had only just begun. Around the crowd, whispers spread rapidly. Some people recognized Marcus immediately now that his name had been spoken aloud. Others simply watched Ethan, whose confidence was beginning to give way to visible uncertainty. Sergeant Daniel Brooks stepped forward with measured professionalism. "Officer Caldwell," he said calmly, "I need you to take a step back for a moment." Ethan hesitated. His training told him to follow the instruction immediately, yet his pride struggled to accept what had just unfolded. "Sergeant, I did not know," Brooks answered in the same steady tone. "That is exactly why we verify facts before drawing conclusions." The words landed with unmistakable weight. Marcus looked toward Brooks and offered a slight nod of appreciation before turning his attention to the city manager. "I apologize for delaying the meeting," he said. "It appears the afternoon developed differently than any of us expected." Even now, there was no anger in his voice, no accusation, no attempt to embarrass anyone. The city manager replied respectfully, "Sir, everyone has been waiting for you, but that can wait. Right now, we need to make sure the situation is handled properly." Ethan listened in stunned silence. For the first time since stepping out of his patrol vehicle, he began replaying every decision he had made. The assumptions, the questions, the refusals, Most of all, he remembered denying Marcus the opportunity to make a single phone call. A quiet feeling settled over him. Not panic, but the growing realization that the consequences of a decision often begin long before anyone notices them. Before anyone could speak again, another city sedan stopped beside the curb. Andre Collins stepped out, carrying a leather portfolio and looking immediately toward Marcus. "Sir," he called respectfully, "the revised redevelopment contracts are ready for your signature before tonight's council session." The statement removed every remaining doubt. Several people in the crowd exchanged astonished looks. Ethan slowly lowered his eyes, understanding that the man he had questioned about community projects had, in fact, been personally overseeing them all along. Marcus accepted the portfolio with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Andre." Then he turned back toward Ethan, his expression still calm, still free of resentment. "Officer," he said quietly, "every resident deserves to be heard before they are judged. That principle protects all of us." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could find the words, Sergeant Brooks's department phone rang once again. He answered immediately, listened for several seconds, and his expression became even more serious than before. When the call ended, he looked directly at Ethan and spoke carefully enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Officer Caldwell, Internal Affairs has just informed me that they are responding to this location, and they have requested that every body camera recording from today's encounter be preserved without exception." Sergeant Daniel Brooks slipped his phone back into his pocket as the words from Internal Affairs settled over the crowd like a sudden change in the weather. No one spoke for several seconds. Officer Ethan Caldwell remained frozen beside his patrol vehicle, his mind racing through every moment of the encounter from the instant he crossed the street until now. For the first time that afternoon, he looked less like an officer in complete control and more like a man realizing that every decision had been permanently recorded. Marcus Ellington noticed the silence but made no effort to fill it. He had spent enough years leading a city to understand that people often learn the most during quiet moments. Emily Foster continued filming, careful to keep the entire scene in frame. She knew that a complete record mattered more than dramatic angles or emotional reactions. Nearby, several members of the crowd lowered their own phones, recognizing that the situation was no longer about public curiosity, but about accountability. Sergeant Brooks finally spoke. "Officer Caldwell, from this point forward, I need you to avoid discussing the details of this encounter with anyone except investigators." Ethan nodded automatically. "Yes, Sergeant." His voice lacked the certainty it had carried only minutes earlier. Brooks continued, "Your body camera will remain secured as evidence. That protects everyone involved, including you." Marcus quietly acknowledged the statement with a respectful nod. He appreciated that Brooks was focused on procedure rather than appearances. Across the sidewalk, the city manager stepped beside Marcus. "Sir, transportation is ready whenever you are." Marcus glanced toward the waiting vehicles before looking back at Ethan. "They can wait another minute." The city manager seemed slightly surprised but said nothing. Marcus slowly walked a few steps closer to Ethan, stopping at a respectful distance that gave neither man the appearance of intimidation. Ethan looked up, expecting anger, disappointment, or even humiliation. Instead, Marcus spoke with remarkable calm. "Officer Caldwell, today has been difficult for both of us, but I hope you understand something important." Ethan swallowed quietly. "Yes, sir." Marcus continued, "I did not ask to be treated differently because of my office. I asked to be treated fairly before anyone knew my office." Those words settled over the crowd with unmistakable force. Emily noticed several people quietly nodding. Even Brooks lowered his eyes briefly, reflecting on the simplicity of the statement. Respect Marcus had demonstrated should never depend upon status. It should begin with every person equally. Before Ethan could respond, another unmarked sedan arrived at the scene. Two professionally dressed investigators stepped out, each carrying identification folders rather than emergency equipment. They approached Brooks first, introduced themselves, and quietly confirmed the time of the encounter. Ethan recognized the insignia immediately. Internal Affairs had arrived far sooner than he expected. One investigator politely asked Brooks, "Has every recording device remained active throughout the contact?" Brooks answered without hesitation. Yes, his body camera remained on, and several independent witnesses appear to have recorded portions of the event as well. Emily instinctively lowered her phone for a moment, realizing she might soon be asked to provide her recording. One of the investigators glanced toward her and made a brief note on a tablet without interrupting anyone. Marcus remained completely composed. He neither encouraged nor discouraged the investigation. He simply trusted the process he had spent years strengthening as mayor. Ethan watched all of this unfold with growing clarity. The consequences were no longer based on opinions or assumptions. They would be based on facts preserved minute by minute. As one investigator prepared to collect Ethan's body camera according to department policy, the second investigator received a phone call, listened for several moments, and then looked directly toward Marcus before quietly saying, "There is one additional piece of evidence that just became available, and according to dispatch, it changes the timeline in a way none of us expected." The second Internal Affairs investigator ended the call and looked towards Sergeant Daniel Brooks before addressing everyone gathered on the sidewalk. "Dispatch has completed a synchronized review of the communications log," he said calmly. "The timeline confirms that the initial records check cleared Mr. Ellington several minutes before the encounter continued." A quiet murmur spread through the crowd. Brooks closed his eyes briefly. He had already suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed transformed concern into certainty. Ethan Caldwell stood motionless. Every passing second seemed to make the afternoon heavier. The investigator continued in a professional tone. "The radio transmissions, body camera timestamps, and dispatch recordings all align. The information confirming there was no criminal basis for extending the stop was received before additional questioning continued." No accusation appeared in his voice. He simply stated facts. Marcus Ellington listened without interruption. He had spent years insisting that government institutions should rely on documented evidence rather than emotion, and now those same principles were quietly unfolding in front of him. Emily Foster stepped forward when one investigator politely asked whether she would be willing to preserve the video she had recorded. "Of course," she answered. "I recorded everything from the moment the officer first asked for identification." The investigator thanked her and explained that her recording would simply become one part of the overall review. Emily appreciated the response. Nobody seemed interested in sensational headlines. They were interested in accuracy. That difference mattered. Nearby, several witnesses voluntarily approached as well, offering their names and contact information without being prompted. An older veteran who had watched most of the encounter quietly explained that Marcus had remained respectful from beginning to end. A delivery driver confirmed that he had never seen Marcus refuse an instruction. Even the city maintenance employee admitted that he had recognized the mayor almost immediately, but chose not to interfere after receiving Marcus's subtle signal to remain back. Each statement painted the same picture from a different angle. Halfway through collecting witness information, one investigator received the complete upload from Ethan's body camera. He reviewed only a few moments before stopping the playback and looking toward Brooks. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "the recording is consistent with every witness statement we have received so far." Brooks gave a slow nod. There was no visible relief in his expression, only the solemn recognition that the evidence was remarkably consistent. Ethan lowered his head. For the first time all afternoon, he spoke without defensiveness. "I should have listened sooner." Marcus heard the words but did not answer immediately. He believed that meaningful reflection deserved silence before response. The crowd had become equally quiet. The tension that once centered on suspicion had shifted toward accountability. After several moments, Marcus finally spoke. "Every officer carries enormous responsibility. The public depends on careful judgment because trust is built one decision at a time." Ethan looked up slowly. Marcus continued, "When assumptions replace facts, everyone loses, including the officers who work honorably every single day." Brooks recognized the importance of those words. They were not spoken to embarrass Ethan. They were spoken for everyone listening. The lead investigator closed his folder and addressed Ethan with measured professionalism. Officer Caldwell, effective immediately, your administrative status will be determined through the formal review process outlined. By department policy, you will receive written instructions before the end of today. Ethan quietly acknowledged the statement. He understood that the outcome would now be decided by documented evidence rather than public opinion. As Marcus prepared to leave for the meeting that had been delayed for nearly an hour, the city manager handed him a small folder that had just been delivered from City Hall. Marcus opened it, scanned the first page, and paused. His expression remained calm, but Brooks noticed the subtle change immediately. "What is it, sir?" Brooks asked. Marcus slowly closed the folder and looked toward the investigators before answering. It appears this was not the first formal complaint involving premature assumptions during a public encounter, and what is inside this report may explain far more than anyone standing here realizes. Marcus Ellington looked at the folder for another moment before handing it to the lead internal affairs investigator. "This belongs with your review," he said quietly. "Whether the information supports or contradicts today's events, it deserves to be examined through the proper process." The investigator accepted it with a respectful nod. "Thank you, Mayor. We will include it with the case file." Marcus smiled faintly. "Do not include it because I am the mayor. Include it because every fact matters." Those words lingered in the afternoon air as strongly as anything spoken that day. The crowd slowly began to disperse, yet many people remained thoughtful rather than excited. They had witnessed something far more significant than an ordinary public encounter. They had watched assumptions collide with evidence, and evidence quietly prevail. Emily Foster stopped recording for the first time since the encounter had begun. She looked down at the video on her phone and realized it did not capture a dramatic confrontation. It captured something more valuable. It showed how a calm voice, patient cooperation, and documented facts could reveal the truth without a single raised fist or shouted threat. She quietly saved multiple copies of the recording, hoping it would help investigators preserve an accurate account of everything that had happened. Sergeant Daniel Brooks approached Marcus before he left. "Sir, I want to apologize that this occurred in our city." Marcus shook his head gently. "Sergeant, what defines a community is not whether mistakes happen. It is whether people have the courage to correct them honestly." Brooks extended his hand. Marcus accepted it without hesitation. The gesture lasted only a moment, but it reflected mutual respect built on accountability rather than position. A short distance away, Ethan Caldwell remained beside his patrol vehicle while investigators completed the administrative steps required by department policy. He watched Marcus preparing to leave and gathered the courage to speak. "Mayor Ellington." Marcus turned. Ethan continued carefully. "I cannot change what happened this afternoon, but I can acknowledge that I should have listened before I judged." Marcus regarded him quietly before answering. "Acknowledging a mistake is the beginning. Learning from it is what protects the next person you meet." Ethan nodded slowly. There was no argument left to make, no excuse capable of changing the documented record. The only meaningful decision remaining belonged to the future. Marcus entered the waiting city vehicle with Andre Collins, while the city manager and department directors followed behind. As the convoy pulled away toward City Hall, the delayed meeting finally resumed nearly an hour late. Yet no one complained about the schedule. Every official in the room understood that the events outside had become an unexpected lesson about leadership, responsibility, and public trust. In the weeks that followed, the formal review relied on dispatch records, body camera footage, witness statements, and established department procedures. The outcome reflected the evidence collected throughout the investigation, and Officer Ethan Caldwell's employment with the department came to an end through the official disciplinary process. Marcus never held a press conference to celebrate the decision. Instead, during the next city council meeting, he addressed the community with the same quiet confidence that had carried him through the entire encounter. "The law earns respect when it is applied fairly," he said. "No title, no uniform, and no position should ever determine who deserves dignity. Every resident should receive the same patience, the same fairness, and the same opportunity to be heard." The chamber remained silent for several seconds before people slowly rose to their feet. It was not a celebration of one man's authority. It was recognition of a principle larger than any individual. Outside City Hall, the repaired streetlight Marcus had intended to inspect that afternoon finally illuminated the sidewalk below, casting a steady light across the place where everything had begun. Sometimes justice arrives with sirens. Sometimes it arrives with evidence. And sometimes the most powerful reminder of all is that a badge may represent authority, but only character earns lasting respect.